By 2050, Europe will have a unique position in the world, but not in a good way. That's because Europe will become the only continent on Earth that will have seen a decline in its total population in the 50 years between the year 2000 and 2050. According to UN population estimates, every other continent on Earth will have seen an increase in their total population, except Europe. So let's start by answering a simple question. Just how bad will Europe's population decline be? In percentage terms, Europe's population will shrink by 3% by 2050, from 728 million people in the year 2000. Now, it's only a slight shrink in percentage terms, which by itself might not be a cause for concern. But it becomes pretty concerning when you compare it to what will happen in other continents. So let's look at the data in full. Asia and Africa will see an increase in their total population of around 43% and 212% respectively. And these two will also become the only continents with populations of over 1 billion people each by 2050. Meanwhile, the two cousins in the Americas will also see an increase as well. The total populations in North and South America will grow by around 40% each between the year 2000 and 2050. And then of course there's Oceania, which will see an 87% increase in its total population within the same time frame. So given this backdrop of population increase on every continent in the world, Europe standing as the only continent with a decline in its total population by 2050 stands out even more. So let's tackle the obvious question here. Why exactly will Europe's population decline? The first thing to establish is that given that we're talking about an entire continent, some of the causes or factors behind the population decline will not apply to every single country equally. But when looked at on average, the factors strongly contribute to Europe's collapsing population. The first factor is Europe's declining birth rate, and this factor is huge. Now, of course, the fertility rate required for any country in the world to at least replace its existing population and avoid a decline is 2.1 births per woman. But based on data from 2021, across all of Europe, there is no single country in the European Union with a fertility rate that's above the threshold of 2.1 births per woman. In fact, we can go one step further and say that aside from a handful of countries like France, Czech, and Romania, there are no European countries that are close to having a fertility rate of 2.1 births per woman. That is a pretty stark data point, because the bottom line in terms of what it means is that there is no country in Europe with a birth rate that is sufficient enough to replace the local population and ensure some stability for the future. On average, the birth rate across Europe is 1.53 births per woman, but even that is lower than what it was nearly 10 years ago, in 2016, when it stood at 1.57 births per woman. But remember how I said some of the factors do not apply equally to every country across the continent? We can illustrate that with two questions. The first, which European countries have the lowest fertility rates? According to 2021 data from Eurostat, Italy has a birth rate of 1.25 births per woman, while Spain has a birth rate of 1.19 births per woman. And then of course there's Malta, with a birth rate of 1.13 births per woman, which of course is the lowest across all of Europe. And on the flip side of that, the second question to ask is also obvious. Which European countries have the highest fertility rates? Again, according to Eurostat data, Romania ranks third with 1.81 births per woman, Czech Republic ranks second with 1.83 births per woman, and France ranks first with 1.84 births per woman, which is probably not a surprise, given that Paris, the capital of France, is globally known as the city of love and romance, which is a great recipe for having a high birth rate. But here's the thing, even the countries with the highest birth rates in Europe are seeing those birth rates fall. France's birth rate of 1.8 births per woman in 2021 has now dropped to 1.68 births per woman, according to the latest data from the National Institute of Statistics and Economic Studies in France. Overall, the low average birth rate across the continent means that the natural change in Europe's population has been negative since 2012. And in simple terms, this means that for the last 12 years, there have been more people dying than being born in Europe. So what does this mean for Europe in the long term? As most demographic studies suggest, a low birth rate will result in the continent getting much older than it currently is and at a faster rate. One study by the European Parliament suggests that the average age in Europe will be 49 years old by 2050. But aside the data on average ages, another way to illustrate this is with a population pyramid. Now, looking at this, we can clearly see that by 2100, there will be more people aged over 80 than people aged under 20 in the European Union. Now, a fast aging continent also means a shrinking labor force, with fewer people able to work and contribute effectively to local economies. Having more pensioners and fewer people of working age also means that on average, governments across these countries will struggle to generate taxes to run the country, because in simple terms, there will be fewer people of working age to tax. The bad news is having fewer people able to pay taxes results in higher tax burdens for those who can pay. For example, the study by the European Parliament also shows that as of 2008, there were 4 people of working age for every pensioner over 65. But by 2050, that number will drop to 2 workers paying for 1 pensioner. So how does Europe fix this problem? One answer that appears to be in play right now is immigration. The European Parliament study projects that Europe will need around 56 million immigrant workers by 2050 to compensate for the decline in its population and in its labor force. And we can already see this in effect in countries like Sweden and Germany, which have welcomed thousands of immigrants over the past decade. But what we have also seen is that immigration may not be a silver bullet for these countries in Europe, because anti-immigration sentiments are rising in some countries, where the citizens say that immigration is happening too much and too quickly. Now, ultimately, at a continental level, Europe's population decline due to birth rate and the lack of a decline seen elsewhere does not necessarily mean that every country in continents like Asia and Africa will experience non-stop growth. In fact, if you've watched some of my previous videos, then you know that China, Japan, and South Korea, for example, are all facing sharp population collapses due to fertility rates that are currently below Europe's average. But the good news for continents like Asia and Africa is that unlike Europe, there are still a few countries on those continents that have very high birth rates, which will drive fast population growth in the coming years on those continents. Now, as other continents grow compared to Europe, the implication is that it's not just Europe's population that will shrink, but also its share of the global population. In 1900, at the start of the 20th century, the population in Europe accounted for nearly 30% of the global population, making Europe the second most populated continent in the world. But things have only gotten worse since then. By the year 2000, Europe's share of the global population had shrunk to around 11%, and by 2050, it will have shrunk even further, landing at around 7% of global population. Now, the big question is this: can Europe successfully reverse its population decline? Unfortunately, history suggests that's unlikely to happen, because most demographic studies and data suggest that population decline due to falling birth rates is historically difficult to reverse once the trend sets in. So in the case of Europe, governments and decision makers have a few more decades to reshape their countries and to create new policies that encourage more births, and hopefully prove history wrong. Thanks for watching. If you enjoyed this, then please give the video a thumbs up, as that really helps the channel, and don't forget to subscribe as well. And before you go, make sure you check out this playlist of other cool geography videos I've made on the channel. See you in the next one.